including the one that I work for. The second topic I want to talk about is regulation of toxic substances under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act and CERCLA, the Superfund Law, which also are topics for your next week's discussion of Waste Management Chapter 9. So I'm really not emphasizing all of the requirements of those laws, but just sort of how they, because there's sort of an overlap. They deal with waste and they deal with toxic substances. So there's some overlap, and you may hear some of the same references next week, and when Mr. Dubman talks to you, and so hopefully it'll reinforce each other. So I'm going to push a button and see what happens. There we go. And can people see that okay, or it's not too bright? All right. So I work in an agency under the executive branch of California's government, which means I work for the governor through a chain of command to the Secretary for Environmental Protection, and then I work in a department which is under the umbrella of the California Environmental Protection Agency. So the agency I work for was created almost 25 years ago under a sort of the legal term is, it's a non-codified statute. It was something that was adopted by the legislature called a Governor's Reorganization Plan Number 1 of 1991. And it said all these existing programs that they have that they had at the time for regulating various aspects of environmental protection in California should be put under one umbrella called the Environmental Protection Agency, which kind of mirrors what we've had at the federal level for 40 years. So California EPA is relatively new compared with the US EPA, and is a little less centralized. Each of the parts of it have sort of different, kind of do their own thing with some input from the agency and the secretary. So we have 6 organizations under the umbrella of California EPA, including the department I work for, 2 state level boards, 1 office, and then 9 regional water boards. So this is just a little quick thing. Air Resources Board is ARB. CalRecycle is the newest department. It's the Department of Resources Recycling and Recovery, which was created maybe 7 or 8 years ago out of the ashes of the Integrated Waste Management Board and part of another thing. It doesn't matter, but it's a relatively new one. DPR is Department of Pesticide Regulation. I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these and what they do. DTSC is Department of Toxic Substances Control, which is the department that I've worked for the last 14 years. OEHA is what we call it. OEHHA is the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, and that is a small office of all PhD toxicologist type people who research toxic substances, and I'll talk a little bit about what they do. And then lastly, in that far right box are the State Water Resources Control Board and the Regional Water Quality Control Boards. So just going from left to right, the Air Resources Board, there are about 1,000 people there, give or take, a lot of engineers and scientists. They have a pretty large legal office, and they also have some automotive technicians because part of what they do is administer the smog check program in California. And then they have support staff that help everything run. They have a number of programs, including the Mobile Source Division that kind of regulates vehicles and off-road vehicles, cars, and things like that, mobile sources of air pollution. And my department participates in something called the Multimedia Fuels Evaluation Group. And that is a group that looks at new fuels that are going to be introduced into the market in California, and to make sure that they don't have some unintended, undesirable consequences. And why would we want to do that? Some of you might have heard of something called MTB, which is methyl tert-butyl ether, which was added to prevent smog. It's an oxygenate. And so it actually reduces the smog causing chemicals coming out of the tailpipes of vehicles. And it was added to gasoline to replace tetraethyl lead. Lead, as I'm sure you know, is a toxic metal, so it was decided that lead should be banned and phased out of gasoline. However, there was still a need to prevent smog, so this other chemical was put in. Unbeknownst to the regulators, the people who thought it was a good idea, it turns out that a lot of underground tanks at gas stations leak, and MTBE would leak out with the gasoline, it mixes with water and contaminates the groundwater. So to prevent things like that in the future, there's this multimedia fuels group. And so from that I learned that they have a very broad program looking at fuels, new fuels that come onto the market, and additives that are put into fuels to make sure that they work, and that whatever other consequences you might have from putting a new fuel into use are evaluated and understood so that you don't have surprises later. And I think that's going to be a theme when I get to the third part of my presentation, which will be what we call regrettable substitutes, where you have a chemical that has some toxicity, is problematic for some reason, and you decide it's bad, we're going to ban it, we're going to phase it out, and fail sometimes to think about what the alternatives to that chemical are, and what the possible problems that they might cause could be. So that we'll kind of come back to. They also set some air quality standards, ARB does, for ambient air and toxic hotspots and things like that. They have a research division, they have a monitoring division, laboratories, so they have monitoring stations across the state, and in conjunction with regional, air quality management districts, which are local agencies. And the background here is a smoggy day in Los Angeles. So that's actually buildings there. They also set some control measures for toxic air contaminants. And toxic air contaminants, there's something called the criteria pollutants and the priority pollutants, which are about, there were 6 at the time I studied them, but I think there are 9 now. Things like oxides of nitrogen and ozone and things. And they also set separate standards for a whole slew of toxic air contaminants, which are just acutely toxic if you inhale them and things like that. They help businesses comply. They have some education and outreach materials, and then they, again, work with local air quality management districts, and those districts typically regulate the stationary and non-mobile sources within their air basin. So we're in I think we're in the Yolo Solano district here, and there's one in the Sacramento Valley, and there are ones in the further west Bay Area, and South Coast in Los Angeles is another big air district. Anyway, in a nutshell, Air Resources Board. Second department, or part of the California EPA, is the Department of Pesticide Regulation. And this picture, you see a strawberry, which is a delicious fruit, obviously. And that field in the background has got some plastic tarp over it because it's being fumigated. And there are toxic chemicals that are used to kill pests like nematodes, called methyl bromide and methyl iodide. And I think methyl bromide was banned, and then they delayed the ban, and then they found that methyl iodide was a replacement, but it's also very toxic to people and has a lot of toxicity. It's still not a great chemical. Let's look at what the Department of Pesticide Regulation does. Just digression here. Let me talk first, and then I'll digress. So they register pesticide products for sale or use in California, and to be registered, the manufacturer has to demonstrate to DPR that their safety. They also have a function of licensing people that apply pesticide. And so in my building where I work in downtown Sacramento, they administer tests for pesticide applicators periodically, and so you'll see a whole slew of people lined up waiting outside to go in and take their tests, and it's sort of a proctored exam so that they can show that they understand the hazards of the chemicals, proper way to apply them, personal protection, and things like that. They also have a surveillance element of their program where they're looking at reports of illnesses from people who work in the field and apply pesticides, and do risk assessment on pesticides. So doing some calculation of how many illnesses might result based on how toxic it is, what kind of toxicity it has, how much of it is used, where it's used, things like that. And so that's kind of a scientific analysis of potential risk. They also set some workplace practices for people that apply pesticides, and I already mentioned the monitoring of the impacts of pesticides, not only on the applicators, and they have some grisly pictures if you go to the fourth floor of my building where they monitoring people sit. They have pictures of skin lesions and rashes and people who have been sickened by pesticides. They also have a program to test fruits and vegetables for residues. And there are sort of ceilings or limits on how much pesticide residue can be present in produce. And then they also promote integrated pest management. And again, kind of preaching to the choir, in the building I work in, there's a little kiosk where you can look at, find your garden problem, and then they'll have a non-pesticide way of killing that kind of moth or whatever you might have, or rust on your lawn or something. So the digression that I wanted to make is in Chapter 8 of your book, I was browsing through, it talks about FIFRA, the Federal Insecticide Rodenticide Act, and that is the federal law that governs the registration of pesticides. And that's something that I'm not an expert on, and I'm not particularly talking about. Department of Pesticide Regulation kind of administers that here in California. It is in the book, so I guess it's fair game for your test. So the general concept being that, as it said on an earlier slide, they have to demonstrate safety. They have to provide some data on the pesticide that they want to be registered that says, that talks about the chemistry of it, how it would behave in the environment after you spray it. What happens to it? Does it degrade in sunlight? Does it wash away in the water and potentially contaminate the water? Things like that. And registrations can be canceled, and then the pesticide can't be sold anymore. And furthermore, whatever it was, I forgot, so I'm sorry. I had a good point. Moving on to the next part of the California EPA is CalRecycle. I mentioned the newest department in our agency. But kind of some of the really visible things that they do is the bottle and can program. The CRV that you pay when you buy a bottled beverage is administered by them, and it's paid out at the collection centers. I don't know if any of you take bottles and cans back, you can get cash for them. So the whole sort of concept behind the beverage container program is just to divert things from being in solid waste, and I think that's more for a topic for your next week's lecture. They have a waste diversion goal that they set recently of 75%, meaning that 75% of the waste that goes into the waste stream doesn't go to a landfill, it goes to reuse or reclamation or something other than a hole in the ground. They also have some programs to promote recycling of various consumer products that have problems, either toxicity or other waste handling challenges, like used motor oil, which is a hazardous waste in many cases. Used paint is sometimes a hazardous waste, and they have a program for that under a piece of legislation. Electronic waste, which is another hazardous waste. And then mattresses, which are just sort of a bulky item that take up a lot of space in landfills. So they're trying to promote something called extended producer responsibility, which means generally that if you make one of these problematic products and you put them into commerce, you sell them, that you have some responsibility for what happens to it when it's used up or done or finished, when nobody wants it anymore, that you shouldn't just say, you know, well, it's your problem now, you figure it out, but you ought to design things for recycling, have take-back programs, educate the public, things like that. So that's one of their planks of their what they do. They also give grants to local governments to collect household hazardous waste, and they oversee local agencies that give permits to landfills. And solid waste landfills are heavily regulated, I don't know if probably some of you have been to the dump to haul stuff to the dump. I went to a landfill in Chula Vista in San Diego County on a tour. Just got to go to a really fun conference where we got to tour landfills. And this one was a brand new landfill cell that hadn't been, nothing had been put in it yet. And it was a massive, just hundreds of yards across, hole in the ground, lined with plastic. And it's got a double liner, and they collect water that percolates through, which is called leachate, and test it for toxics. They also collect the gas that comes out of the decomposing garbage, and they burn it and generate power. All of those things are regulated, and it's a really, seeing it empty actually really is eye-opening. And the guy giving the tour had a hard hat that was a cowboy hat, but it was a hard hat. And he said that that it would be 2 years to fill that thing up, and which is shocking how much garbage we generate. So that's one of the things Cal Recycle, as they're called, is trying to promote, is diversion of waste so that we don't fill landfills so much. So they're not really in the realm of toxics, which is our topic tonight. However, the next one, which is the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, is a regulator of toxic substances for sure. And really, regulator isn't quite the right word. The most visible thing, there are two most visible things that OEHA does are these warnings that you've seen all around everywhere. You can't really miss them at 7-Eleven, at the gas station, everywhere you shop, parking lots. They have these warnings about this area contains chemicals known to the state of California to cause cancer, or birth defects, or reproductive harm. And recently I actually saw one at Starbucks that said coffee contains, roasted coffee contains some chemicals, and even if you make it at home, those chemicals are going to be in it too. I thought it was kind of, well, I was a little surprised. But anyway, there's detectable levels of cancer-causing chemical in toast. So technically, if you sell toast, maybe you have to put this sign on it. So what this agency does is they actually assess their toxicologists. And a toxicologist, I'm going to talk a little bit about toxicology in my next set of slides, but it's the science of poisons. And so it has to do with the action of poisons on people or on other creatures, other organisms, how they enter the body, how they affect the body, how they're metabolized, how long it takes the chemical to be excreted. And so the people who work in this office are all specialists in some aspect of toxicology, and they do exhaustive research on one chemical at a time to see ones that are thought to cause cancer or birth defects or reproductive harm. And they create a document, a literature review that spells out all the findings in all the published scientific literature about that chemical. And then if it's found that it has one of those hazard traits of causing cancer or causing birth defects or reproductive harm, they will add it to a list. And so there's a list of chemicals, the Proposition 65 list. And it's continuously updated. Things are added to it all the time, and even in recent years. And I'll come back to that Proposition 65 list a little bit later. So the third bullet there, second, whatever, implements the Safe Drinking Water and Toxic Enforcement Act was actually passed by the people of California. It was a voter initiative that was put on the ballot by signatures, and it was passed almost 30 years ago now. And it's a pretty significant one.
I just want to mention to everybody real quick that I believe that we'll have access to these slides. And I'll put them up for your study purposes, so you don't have to write down everything that you see here. You can just listen and take notes beyond what's there.
Yeah.
This will be provided.
And thank you for clarifying that.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I should have said that earlier.
So yeah, you can just listen and write down a few things. This probably work well. So they also set some exposure, risk-based exposure levels for air contaminants, water contaminants, soil contaminants. And then the other kind of visible thing they do is they issue fish consumption advisories. So certain toxic chemicals have a tendency to enter into animals, including fish, and so, and then where they can build up. And so what that can, the result of that can be that you'll see higher level of the chemical in the fish than you see in the water that they're swimming in. And so they call that phenomenon bioaccumulation. And certain water bodies in California have problems with different toxic substances. Mercury is a really common one, though, because we have a legacy of gold mining and mercury mining in California. And in gold mining, a lot of mercury is used to capture the small particles of gold because it agglomerates and it makes an amalgam of gold, and then you can heat it up, boil off the mercury, and then collect the gold. So for 100 years, people were using mercury on a large scale to collect gold, and they were mining the mercury in the Coast Range around here, around San Jose. And so there's a lot of residual mercury in the environment, and it can be converted into methyl mercury, which is a especially kind of toxic form of mercury that enters fish. Certain fish can be dangerous to eat, especially if you are a child or a pregnant woman, nursing mother, things like that. So they set these advisories based on the individual water body, the individual contaminant, and the way it will read is, fish are healthy and good for you. However, if you catch fish in this water body and you are this kind of a person, you should not exceed more than 1 meal a week, 2 meals a week, things like that. So that's usually the way those advisories come. So the Proposition 65 documents are really technical toxicology, PhD things that only other PhD people read. The fish advisories really are intended for the general public, sport fishermen and women, and including they put some of them out in Spanish and other languages so that people who catch fish can actually understand them. And the other bullet here is the biomonitoring program, which is a pretty interesting program here in California. And there's another one on the national level at the Centers for Disease Control. What biomonitoring refers to is not just monitoring biological things generally, but actually human biomonitoring, where we have a program where they're collecting data on what kinds of chemicals are in our bodies that enter our bodies through the air we breathe, the dust in our environment, the food we eat, the water we drink. There's really in a sea of chemicals, and a lot of them are very low levels, but they're detectable, and some of them accumulate. And they don't have really drastic effects. We're not all keeling over, but it's something to be wary of and to monitor. And so they've got a program which my department also participates in that involves testing samples of human, for example, milk, breast milk, blood, adipose tissue, different tissues and fluids and things to try and see what chemicals are found in there. And so that's sort of just maybe an early warning of something that needs looking into more. So it's pretty early days, and they don't do separate collection of samples. Typically they get the samples from somebody doing research on something else, or there's a study of nurses in LA. They'll say, can you spare some blood samples so we can also look for these metals, say, or something like that. Okay, so moving to the water, which I think was the one on the farthest right of my little organizational chart. State Water Resources Control Board. They have several programs that are the big ones. The water quality program that deals with regulating stormwater. If you have some, for example, a parking lot, you have to get a stormwater permit for the mitigate or control the runoff of toxic things into the storm drain. Wastewater treatment plants have to have permits to discharge into the waters of the state, whether it's into the San Francisco Bay or into a river or the ocean. They also are involved with cleaning up contaminated sites that are contaminating water. They regulate underground tanks, and they have an enforcement element. They also have a sort of that's sort of the I guess, the regulatory and enforcement side. They also have a financial assurance element that they use to help fund certain activities, such as building water recycling facilities, cleaning up messes, leaking underground tanks, things like that. And then the third is the Water Rights Program, and again, that's a permitting function that talks about the use, diversion, and storage of water. And generally, water is something that belongs to the people, and so there's an agency, that's one of their functions, is to sort of give permits for using and diverting water. Not a toxic topic per se. Here's a toxic picture though, however, which this is some, the orange stuff is water that's contaminated. It's probably acidic mine drainage. And I don't remember where this picture was taken, but it's in the Central Valleys. So this is something that regional water quality control boards would be sort of responsible for. There are 9 boards in California, and they're based around watersheds, how the water drains in a particular area. The members are appointed by the governor, and they set water quality requirements based on a specific area that they're responsible for, including establishing waste discharge requirements and issuing permits, and they also have an enforcement function. So that's just a nutshell description of the other parts of the California EPA. And then lastly, I'll talk a bit about Department of Toxic Substances Control, which is the department that I work for, and what we do. And this picture sort of illustrates different aspects of our work. So the rolling, kind of pretty hillside there is one of the hazardous waste landfills that we, probably a closed cell or something from the hazardous waste landfill. Lower left is a hazardous waste site. There's probably a hazardous waste recycling facility on the lower right, and then some toxic jewelry. So those are all sort of parts of what we do. And we go in the correct direction. So again, really this is just kind of orientation. It's like there's a big bureaucracy that does different things relating to environmental protection. So drilling down in toxic substances control, we have Brownfields and Environmental Restoration Program. They oversee site cleanups when hazardous waste or hazardous substances have been released, or hazardous waste has been mismanaged, and there's a mess to clean up. And we have a program that sort of parallels the federal CERCLA Superfund program in California. And so we oversee site cleanups in conjunction with EPA, contaminated sites. Second, really a large program in DTSC is the Hazardous Waste Management Program. So the Brownfields and Environmental Restoration Program, we call it the Site Mitigation Program. It's sort of dealing with the sins of the past, things that weren't done right that caused environmental contamination. And the Hazardous Waste Management Program sort of deals with present management of hazardous waste. And the details of the hazardous waste law, I think, are a topic for next week. The program adopts standards saying what is hazardous waste, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit because that is really a toxic substances sort of topic. So they adopt standards for what is hazardous waste, what rules do people that produce hazardous waste or transport it, accept it, store it, recycle it, or dispose of it have to follow. They also issue permits to what we call a treatment, storage, and disposal facility, or TSDF, and that is a facility that accepts hazardous waste to either treat it, which is to do something to it, typically some kind of chemical or physical process, for whatever reason. Usually and oftentimes it's to make it less toxic or to reduce its volume or something like that. Anything you do with hazardous waste carries some risk of releases and exposure and harm, so it's pretty heavily regulated. Storing hazardous waste also requires a permit, and of course disposal is a very sort of contentious issue, and that is also requires a permit. And the last bullet there, it says promotes legitimate recycling of hazardous waste. So in the waste management topic, in general there's sort of a push, a desire to find other things to do with unwanted material besides put them in a hole in the ground. So recycling is a good thing, and there are different ways to recycle things. You can recycle hazardous waste by just using it for something. If you have a clean solvent that's used to make circuit boards for iPods or iPhones or something, and it has parts per billion level of metals, it's useless for that, but it's perfectly good for cleaning parts in an auto repair facility, say, things like that. But there are people who will find kind of sneaky ways of calling something recycling to avoid the cost and the burden of actually managing it properly. So we call that sham recycling. So there's a very complex body of statutes and regulations governing the recycling of hazardous waste that are designed to create incentives to recycle it when it's legitimate, but not to let people kind of get around proper waste management in the guise of recycling. When you're, say, one of them I remember was some kind of plating bath sludge from chrome plating facilities that was high in chrome 6, which is a carcinogenic chemical. Somebody had the idea to spray it on cars to prevent rust underneath the car, which you can find non-toxic products that work as well or better, and so it's really just a way of getting rid of the plating sludge. So we said, no, that's not exempt. That's not something we want to encourage. Now, a small program, which is the one I now work in, is called Safer Products in Workplaces, and I have a whole separate little set of slides about that program. And then lastly, we have 2 laboratories. Actually, I have the old name here. It's called the Environmental Chemistry Laboratory. And so they do laboratory testing to figure out what chemicals might be present in a sample and how much. So it's the kind of work I used to do. They use it to support enforcement cases. So we have people in the hazardous waste program who will do inspections, know that the facility is doing something that generates a lot of black sludge, seeing a suspicious patch of black sludge on the ground, scooping up samples. They'll send it to the laboratory, find out if that black sludge is a hazardous waste, and if so, then they've got an enforcement case against the facility for illegal disposal. And they can also issue an order to clean it up and things like that. They also will do, so another thing that people who produce hazardous waste have to do is do a waste determination. They have to test or use their knowledge to decide, is this hazardous waste or not? And so we also can do that in our laboratory. And I'll talk about what the criteria for what is a hazardous waste. That's actually a topic that I have quite a bit on in a little bit. So this is kind of maybe a little dry, just talking about some government agency, but this picture is kind of nice because it sort of shows how everything ties together. So on the, let's see, left side is an oil drilling rig, and that's drilling crude oil out of the ground. And let's say everything in this picture is in California. They send the oil to a refinery where it's refined into lubricating oil, motor oil. Motor oil is then distributed to a O'Reilly's or something, and a do-it-yourself person goes and buys some quarts of this motor oil, changes the oil, drains the used oil into a container, and they may do the right thing and take it to a collection center, or they may throw out the backyard or put it in the trash, which is illegal, but could happen. The collection center, the oil that goes to the collection center is hauled to a re-refining facility, or it could be, a number of things could happen to it. It could be used for a fuel. It could be used like for bunker fuel for a ship or something like that. It could be remade into oil and then go back into the distribution chain. So those are some activities just for an example. And let's say, and I mentioned before, used oil tends to be a hazardous waste. It tends to have toxic metals in it after it's been used. So this next slide kind of shows who regulates each of these activities. So also, I didn't really talk about the middle. You know, there might be some. There's like a Jiffy Lube, and they also are collecting the oil and sending it back for recycling. There might be some leaks that enter into storm drains. That's a stormwater issue. So within the California EPA, the oil change people, the discharge of the oil into the environment, the leaks and spills and storm drains would be under the purview of the State Water Board. The collection of used oil at the collection center is funded and regulated by CalRecycle, and as well as by my department, DTSC. We also regulate hazardous waste transporters and people who do generate hazardous waste, like a quick lube place or a re-refining facility. And Air Resources Board also provides grants and funding here too. So there's a lot of overlapping authority. So this slide is one that actually my boss put together, and I thought it was a nice sort of illustration of how all these different alphabet soup of regulatory agencies overlap each other. How's everybody doing? Okay? Should I just dive in to my next one? I may need a break after this one. Just a quick drink of water. So I'm not using the same theme on this one. Does anybody have any questions so far? Okay. All right. How many of you have had some chemistry? Everybody in high school or here? So, not to insult people, but you've probably seen this thing before, periodic table of the elements, and sort of a systematic way of organizing all the different chemical elements, and toxic chemicals are all composed of things from this table. Some of these are metals that are have their own toxicity, and sometimes something that's not especially toxic when combined into a molecule may become a toxic chemical. So obviously a lot of molecules are composed of carbon and hydrogen and oxygen, things like that, biological molecules. A lot of those, depending on how they're arranged, can be toxic. Sometimes toxicity, so sometimes a molecule will have a beneficial property, like it's a disinfectant, or it makes a nice color that you can use to print a picture, or it preserves food, or preserves maybe pharmaceutical product or something. So it'll have some good property, and it will also have harmful and dangerous properties. So it can be corrosive, toxic, flammable, or explosive, or have some other harmful property. And sometimes the toxic property and the harmful property are one and the same thing, actually. So here's a definition of what is toxicity, or what is a toxicant, is the word that toxicologists use. And it's a poison, or toxicant is a substance that causes harmful effects when administered to a living organism. So that's a pretty broad definition. In fact, if you think about what that's saying, it's really hard to think of a substance that wouldn't actually meet that definition. And in fact, this guy, his full name, he was a Swiss-German physician and alchemist. You all know what an alchemist is? This was a kind of a pseudoscience hundreds of years ago, where people thought they could convert base metals like lead into valuable metals like gold. And so they had this whole kind of quasi-science called alchemy. But this guy, in addition to being a physician and an alchemist, he was also the father of toxicology. And his famous line was, "The dose makes the poison." And so he said, "What is there that is not poison? All things are poison, and nothing is without poison. Solely the dose determines that the thing is not a poison." And I got a kick out of Paracelsus's full name, which was Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim. And in fact, when he was growing up, his family called him Theophrastus, evidently. Anyway, there he is. Famoso Dr. Paracelsus. Okay, so toxicity is not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes drugs use their toxicity to a pathogen, like a bacterium or something, to actually cure disease, or a chemotherapy agent can be toxic, and that can be how it works. You might want to kill algae in a swimming pool, or fungi in an agricultural setting, or you want to kill weeds or insects that cause disease. So toxicity is not inherently necessarily bad. It sort of depends on the context. Preservatives that are used, if any of you wears contact lenses, the solution is mainly a saline solution, sodium chloride water, but it has preservative in it, which is to prevent undesirable things from growing in it. And it used to be a mercury-based preservative, and now it's a formaldehyde-releasing preservative. Both of those things are toxic, which is how they work. Antimicrobials, which are used in hospital settings and things, they're designed to be toxic. They clean your hands with them. Like things like Purell are alcohol-based. They're also toxic. And then some of these sort of more toxic antimicrobials like triclosan and triclocarban were originally used in hospitals and medical settings, and they become really ubiquitous. And now I see when I'm shopping for laundry or dish soap, it says antimicrobial. I avoid it because the triclosan is like using a bazooka to kill a fly. It's really not necessary. Soap without it works just as well, and it actually causes resistance in environmental bacteria. It actually may make us sicker. So I'm not speaking officially for my employer, but personally I steer clear of those chemicals. But it can be a good thing in the right context. So essentially, toxicity is a property of a chemical, and that its propensity or its ability to cause harm to an organism. And it's one of a number of different harmful characteristics that a chemical can have. Corrosivity is another one. Catching fire, ignitability, something that's really flammable, that can be a hazardous property too. But the difference here, and this is kind of maybe a little bit on the next week topic on waste, is whether somebody wants the chemical or the product anymore or not. So we regulate things differently depending on whether it's a product or whether it's waste. So in the world of hazardous waste and toxic substances, we have a number of different categories of things that define it as being a waste. So if something is spent, if you've used it and it's not good anymore, it's you know, cleaning solvent is the example, where it becomes, maybe you're cleaning paintbrushes and you've got some mineral spirits and it's so saturated with paint that it's dirtier than the paintbrush and it's just not really doing anything for you anymore. At that point, when you can't use it anymore, it's spent, it's a waste, and if it has one of the properties that are on this slide, then it's a hazardous waste. Byproducts are things produced incidental to producing something else. You might be making steel or metal to make panels to make vehicles. You also are going to produce byproducts that are not useful. They're like slag, dross, some crud that they skim off the top of the smelting pot. That stuff, if it has one of these properties, is also a hazardous waste. Sludges, I think, probably know what a sludge is. Off-specification products. Somebody manufactures some kind of a caustic or toxic cleaning product or something. It's not quite to spec. It doesn't. Maybe it's they formulated it a little wrong, or they added the wrong fragrance to it, or put it in the wrong label on the container for whatever reason. Can't be used at top specification. That becomes a waste also. So the take home from all that is you can have something that's identical and they're completely different in the eyes of hazardous waste regulation, depending on whether it's something that people want and intend to use and something that is not wanted. So the same bottle of paint stripper that you can buy at Lowe's or somewhere would be regulated completely differently if it's leftover, spent, or unwanted. It's something in your garage for 10 years and you decide you don't need it. And the reason for that is people are much more likely to handle something properly and safely if they value it than if it's a liability, something they want to get rid of. So this slide is the aftermath of a fire, a hazardous waste fire, and so that's the topic, why regulate. So this kind of ties into CERCLA, Superfund Law, and RECRA. So I have a few examples of some really kind of horrific hazardous waste sites that have not been managed in accordance to the rules we have in place now, and so I'll just go through them really quickly. So the first one is pretty famous, and maybe you all know that this was something we heard about in a lot in the 70s, which is called Love Canal, which is a subdivision up in New York State near Niagara Falls. There was a company called Hooker Chemicals which buried hazardous waste in the ground, and not in a highly monitored lined hazardous waste landfill, but just in the ground in drums. And the drums eventually failed and started leaking and seeping. And the people living in the neighborhood started noticing odors, they started seeing seeping chemicals, they got sick and were evacuated. And ultimately it took 21 years and $400 million to clean up the site. And that's a picture of the abandoned houses there. This one is one that my department is working on a many-year cleanup, which is the Stringfellow acid pits. I've been told that this site will take 100 years to clean up. And essentially, this Stringfellow was the name of the guy who owned the property. There was a company that was disposing of a liquid, I believe it was liquid hazardous waste in an old quarry. So it's like a hole in the ground where they've mined stone to use for whatever purpose. And so it seemed like a nice place, pretty inert place to dispose of this waste in unlined ponds. So unfortunately it leached into and contaminated the groundwater and then released chemicals into a nearby creek, and there's still ongoing hazardous treatment going on 50 years later. So this is why we regulate hazardous waste. And then my third example is General Electric, company that you've all heard of. They made PCBs, which used to be, they're a very toxic class of chemicals that were used as a dielectric transformers and lighting ballasts, like things like this for fluorescent lights. And this stuff, they were dumping off-specification PCBs into the Hudson River and caused contamination for 200 miles of the river, and they're continuing to dredge up the sediment to try and remove it. And when I worked in the lab, we were one of 5 labs working on testing samples from the Hudson River, both the water, the sediment, and the fish that were caught in the water, to try and get a profile of what kinds of toxic chemicals were there. And there are a lot of people discharging a lot of nasty things into the sort of Hudson River watershed, so you can sort of get a fingerprint of which toxic chemicals you're finding, and that could lead you maybe back to a particular responsible party who might have been responsible for it. So in response to things like that, Congress about almost 35 years ago enacted the Superfund Law, the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act. I think that's a topic for next week. In a nutshell, it provided broad federal authority to respond to releases or threaten releases of hazardous substances that may endanger public health or the environment. And one feature of the Superfund law is joint and several liability. So one of the things that businesses that generate hazardous waste need to be aware of is where it's going. Because if they give it to somebody to haul to a landfill that's mismanaged, or and eventually leaks or releases hazardous substances into the environment, they could be getting a bill, could be decades later. So that's all I'm going to say about CERCLA. It really is just sort of to set up why we are, why this regulatory program that you'll hear more about next week exists, or what you'll read more about in your Chapter 9 or whatever. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA, and California's Hazardous Waste Control Law. And they're sort of tandem laws. One of them is federal and one is state. And they're very similar. They kind of track each other. In fact, even the regulations are numbered the same, and a lot of the wording is exactly the same. And I'm really going to give just an overview of what RCRA's hazardous waste provisions are about, and then talk a bit about what is a hazardous waste. So the basic concept of this law is cradle-to-grave tracking and responsibility for hazardous waste. So the idea is to make sure that you know where you, the regulator, where hazardous waste is generated, who carries it, where they carry it to, what happens to it there. And so there used to be a paper trail. Now it's more of an electron trail that leads from the generator to the end of the line, whether it's recycling or disposal or whatever. So cradle-to-grave tracking. Under the system of cradle-to-grave tracking, RCRA has sort of three general categories of people. People who generate hazardous waste, so that could generally those people who generate hazardous waste could be me, could be you, could be a business like a dry cleaning shop or an auto repair facility or anything really. I mean, a restaurant that uses caustic cleaners could be a hazardous waste generator. So that's one general category. Secondly is a transporter, and somebody who obviously moves hazardous waste from point A to point B. They're regulated. And then thirdly, treatment, storage, and disposal facility. And I mentioned those earlier. So RCRA dates back almost 40 years to 1976, and it was amended and expanded about 8 years later. And those, there's a sort of citation for where the regulations are in the Code of Regulation, Federal Regulations, Title 40, Parts 260 to 282. Here in California, we have the Hazardous Waste Control Law, and as I mentioned, it pretty much, in many ways, parallels RCRA. Under RCRA, there's a provision that allows a state to be authorized. And so what that means is that they, the people at EPA in Washington, D.C., or in the regional office in San Francisco, in the case of California, have determined that you have, that all the elements of the federal program, you have them in California or whatever your state is, and that they're at least as stringent and equivalent to the federal requirements. And then, assuming that you've been authorized and determined to be no less stringent, there's a grant given by the federal government, and the state essentially takes over implementing the federal law. So that's what we have in California. The department I work for is the authorized, we're an authorized state, and my department actually implements RCRA in California, including issuing permits and then regulating generators of RCRA waste and things like that. And I'll talk about what that means. So our hazardous waste program isn't identical. We have some hazardous waste characteristics that are a little different, and I'll talk a bit about that. And then we have some a few exemptions that aren't in the federal program. We regulate things that they don't regulate, like small quantity generators, they call it conditionally exempt small quantity generators, exempt from regulation under the federal law, but we regulate them here. And under the federal law, RCRA regulations, a household is exempt from, the waste generated by a household is automatically just out. It's not a hazardous waste. We don't recognize that exclusion in California. So even all of us here, if we're getting rid of something, whether it be a solvent or a mercury-containing light bulb or some paint, we are also hazardous waste generators too. However, we're exempted from a lot of the requirements. So I don't want to get into too much about that. I want to focus on the toxicity part. This slide's a little grainy, but I thought it was kind of funny, illustrating the 4 characteristics that are in the hazardous waste control law and in RCRA. Ignitability, so you see the flaming barrel. Corrosivity, you see the barrel with the green stuff oozing out of the sides where it's eaten through. Reactivity, the barrel is exploding and its contents are spewing out. And then lastly, toxicity with a little rat upside down laying on his back, overcome by the fumes. And then this is a little thing we used to give out to kids with another little illustration of the 4 characteristics. So some of these may seem more or less obvious. Some of them are actually a little bit specific. And another kind of aside point, in the world of regulatory things, words matter, definitions really matter, and sometimes we have terms of art that are similar to what you and I might think the word means, but it's not exactly. And sometimes people will get into arguments about whether something is X or Y. Well, it really depends on your framework. If you're a regulator, the word means what it says in the code, whether or not that's what anybody else thinks it means. So ignitable, there actually is a technical definition of ignitability, which is it has a flash point of less than or equal to 140 degrees F. So it has to do with how readily it ignites. Or it's not a liquid and is capable under standard temperature and pressure of causing fire through friction, absorption of moisture, or spontaneous changes. When ignited, burns so vigorously and persistently that it creates a hazard. So that's the term, the definition in the California Code of Regulations. Corrosive waste, in general terms, is something that can obviously damage skin or can eat through metal, things like that. Under the federal definition, corrosivity is limited to liquids, but here in California we have a corrosivity, part of the corrosivity characteristic applies to solids. The way that works is I could take this little thing here and grind it up with an equivalent amount of water and then measure the pH. And if the pH of the water or the slurry is above or below a certain level, then it's a corrosive solid. And so if you know anything about the pH scale from your chemistry class, if you remember, it's a logarithmic scale. It has to do with how many hydrogen ions are present and stuff like that. Generally, things that are very low pH are acidic and they can burn you. And then things that are very alkaline, like lye, sodium hydroxide, they're also corrosive. They're on the other end, they're basic or alkaline. And again, in California we have this not aqueous and mixed with an equal weight of water has a pH within that range also, above or below those two values. There's also an element of the definition that talks about corroding steel, and again it has to do with the rate at which it corrodes steel in a year. So it's very technical sort of definition. Again, reactivity, we might sort of say things that explode are reactive. And that one actually is sort of a narrative one. It doesn't go into too much arcane technical definitional stuff. So it's basically a generator knowledge thing. In the kind of regulatory concept, really the way you would, if we had an enforcement person or inspector going out and there had been an explosion, then we might say, well, clearly it was a reactive waste or it wouldn't have exploded. So, but you kind of know it when you see it. I mean, and once it's